One man looked at this city and saw something no boss before him ever saw, an operating system. Salvatore Luciano, Sicilian immigrant, street soldier, the man who became lucky and rewired an empire. Today, son, you learn the full rise and fall at a man who ended the old mafia and built the new one in its place.
Sicily, 1897. La Cara Fritti didn't raise men, it burned through them, one shift at a time. Sulfur turned skin yellow, lungs weak, and dreams short before they ever started. Antonino Lucania spent his life underground, breaking rock for wages that barely fed 6 mouths. His third son watched from the doorway and swore he'd never touch that mine. That boy's name was Salvatore. Later, the world would call him something else entirely. Sicily in 1897 offered 2 futures, the mine or the boat. Antonino chose the boat. 9-year-old Salvatore crossed the Atlantic below deck, packed among strangers who smelled of salt and fear. The ship did not care who he'd become. It only cared that he survived the crossing.
Ellis Island did not welcome him. It processed him, stamped his name wrong, and moved on. New York gave the family one gift, a tenement room on the Lower East Side. 4 families shared one bathroom. Rats outnumbered residents. Rent still came due every Friday. This wasn't the promised land, son. It was America's basement, and Salvatore lived in it. The street outside spoke 5 languages and trusted none of them equally. Italians fought Jews, Jews fought Irish, everyone fought for the same 6 square blocks. Salvatore learned faster than school could teach him. Loyalty was currency, and currency ran out quick. By 10, he'd already been arrested once, truancy, then theft, then something the record blurred. He started calling himself Charlie. Charlie later became Lucky. The rebrand came before the empire. At 11, he ran a simple racket, a nickel a week from smaller Jewish schoolboys or a beating. One boy refused to pay. His name was Meyer Lansky. He did not run, and he did not flinch. That refusal became a partnership neither the Sicilians nor the Jews at that block ever forgot. Luciano wasn't the strongest kid on Delancey Street. He was simply the one paying attention. He watched merchants, cops, and gang bosses the same way, looking for the seam, the weakness, the price. By 14, he dropped out of school for good, arrested again, and unbothered by any of it. He noticed something most immigrant boys never did. Crime here wasn't chaos, it was structure.
Every insult he swallowed as a boy, he filed. Every debt owed him, he remembered exactly. By 16, cops on Delancey Street already knew his face, his walk, and his growing list of aliases. Every cell was tuition the old country never offered him. Every insult became a lesson filed away. The Lower East Side didn't forgive weakness. It simply waited for someone strong enough to use it. This is where empires start, son. Not in a palace, but in a slum with no clean exit, no mercy, and no inheritance.
The 5 Points was more than a gang. It was New York's first criminal business school. Its classrooms were pool halls, back rooms, docks, and streets where every mistake had witnesses. Luciano entered as a Sicilian teenager with no rank, no inheritance, and no protected surname. There, he met Frankie Yale, a Brooklyn racketeer who turned clubs, protection, and liquor into organized income. Yale did not lecture Luciano. He showed him how men could make a street corner pay weekly. At Yale's tables, runners carried envelopes, collectors counted cash, and managers kept the real points. Luciano saw the hierarchy clearly. The fists created fear, but the books decided who got rich. That was his first break from the old country code. Blood earned entry, efficiency earned power. Meyer Lansky, the Jewish boy who once refused him, had become something more useful, a calculating partner. Lansky read card odds, remembered debts, and treated every gamble like a balance sheet. Then there was Benjamin Siegel, the Brooklyn-born Jewish street fighter, called Bugs by men who knew his temper. Siegel had speed, nerve, and a violent reputation, but Luciano noticed his value went beyond muscle. Together, the three represented what the old bosses feared: talent moving across ethnic lines without permission. Luciano did not ask whether a man was Italian. He asked whether the man could deliver. In 5 Points, Irish bookmakers turned horse race gossip into weekly income before noon. Jewish gamblers ran card rooms with mathematics, while Italian crews collected protection from neighborhood businesses. At the East River docks, stolen cargo passed between accents, hands, and trucks without ceremony. Nobody needed a shared flag when everybody understood the split and the next delivery. Luciano watched those operations until he recognized their common anatomy: labor, collection, accounting, command. A runner risked arrest. A collector risked revenge. The organizer collected from both risks. That distinction changed him. He stopped admiring the loudest man and began studying the quietest one. The quiet man owned the ledger, knew the police schedule, and decided which crew received work. Luciano learned to listen at sit-downs because loud men revealed their hunger before negotiations ended. He learned that tradition mattered only while it protected profits, territory, and dependable partners. By 19, he was no longer just surviving the Lower East Side, he was mapping it. 5 Points taught him crime was not chaos, son. It was a corporation waiting for better management. The gang offered no clean future, only fast lessons about who paid, who obeyed, and who disappeared.
Luciano took those lessons personally, filing each face, each failure, and each profitable connection away. He remained outside every fixed allegiance, close enough to learn, distant enough to leave when necessary. That distance would become his advantage when older men started confusing fear with permanent authority. For now, he watched the city work, money crossing boundaries faster than old loyalties ever could. And Salvatore Luciano was slowly becoming the observer, ruthless enough to provide it alone.
In 1920, America outlawed alcohol and accidentally created the largest black market the country had ever seen. Every closed brewery became an opportunity. Every thirsty city became territory. Every bottle became profit. Prohibition did not create criminals, son. It promoted street criminals into industrial suppliers overnight. Luciano was 23 when the Volstead Act turned his neighborhood education into a national business. His boss was Giuseppe Joe Masseria, the Sicilian head of New York's largest crime family. Masseria recruited Luciano as a young gunman, seeing a useful soldier where Luciano saw a larger machine. Joe the boss ruled through blood, old country ritual, territorial pride, and men waiting for orders.
Luciano respected Masseria's power, but recognized that his empire was built for a smaller century. Then came Arnold Rothstein, a Jewish New York gambler, financier, and underworld strategist called the Brain. Rothstein treated crime like finance, capital, inventory, distribution, protection, and controlled risk. Around Rothstein, Luciano saw lawyers, accountants, brewers, boat captains, truckers, and gunmen serving one market. The product was illegal liquor. The operation looked more organized than most legitimate companies. Canadian whiskey arrived by boat. Rum came through Atlantic routes. Trucks fed Manhattan's hidden bars. Warehouses held crates. Drivers held schedules. Enforcers held territory when competitors challenged the delivery chain. Luciano understood the breakthrough immediately. Violence was no longer the business. It protected the business.
By the mid-20s, bootlegging made him a millionaire before most men his age owned a suit. But money alone did not interest him. Scale did. Routes, crews, suppliers, customers, and reliable percentages. Meyer Lansky handled numbers, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, his Brooklyn partner, represented enforcement. Frank Costello was a Calabrian-born racketeer whose real weapon was access to politicians, unions, and police favors. Vito Genovese was Luciano's ambitious Sicilian associate, valued for manpower, loyalty, and an appetite for advancement. Together, they formed the younger network inside Masseria's aging empire, connected by profit rather than ceremony. Each shipment required a broker, captain, warehouseman, driver, buyer, and silent police officer on somebody's payroll. Luciano studied the chain like an engineer studies a factory floor. No romance, only bottlenecks. A delayed truck cost money. A loose collector invited theft. A careless shooter attracted headlines. The law erased legal competition, leaving demand intact and rewarding whoever coordinated the entire forbidden supply chain. No family could satisfy that appetite alone, making alliances less sentimental and far more necessary. New York speakeasies became retail outlets, each a discrete storefront for a continental supply network. Behind velvet curtains, bartenders poured scotch, while Luciano's associates measured what every neighborhood could absorb. The new crew shared neither ancestry nor manners, but every man understood his assigned function. The old bosses measured power in soldiers. Luciano measured it in volume, speed, reach, and dependable percentages. He was no longer merely a man from the street, son. He was learning to operate the system. Prohibition gave him the market. The next ruthless, bloody war would finally give him the entire company. October 1929 gave Luciano a lesson no ledger, gun, or mentor could ever provide. A man can build routes, buy favors, and collect millions, then discover he still belongs to somebody's darkness. One night, unknown men took Charles Luciano for what gangsters called a one-way ride. They beat him, stabbed him, cut his throat, and left his body near a Staten Island road. The men who found him saw blood, torn clothes, a ruined face, and a man barely alive. Luciano later gave little away. He named no attackers, offered no clean explanation, and remembered everything. That silence mattered. In his world, surviving an attack was not luck, it was information. Someone had decided he was becoming too valuable, too independent, or too dangerous to leave standing. Before that night, Luciano was a rising operator inside other men's structures, profitable but still expendable. Afterward, every room carried a different meaning. Who sat closest, who watched exits, who knew schedules. The scars changed his face, earning him the nickname Lucky, but the betrayal altered his calculations far more profoundly. He had seen how quickly alliances became funeral arrangements when money, territory, and ambition collided.
He understood that a boss who depended on one faction could be delivered to an enemy. So he began building something colder, relationships spread across crews, neighborhoods, and old ethnic boundaries.
Masseria offered rank. Rothstein had offered method. The attack gave Luciano a permanent reason to outgrow both. He returned to business with a damaged eye, a scarred face, and patience stripped of innocence. The city read those scars as a warning. Luciano read them as a contract. Never again would he place his future entirely inside another man's family, ritual, or protection. He strengthened ties with Lansky, the calculating Jewish partner who understood systems over sentiment. He trusted Siegel's nerve, Costello's political contacts, and Genovese's appetite for climbing through violence. But he trusted no one completely, because the Staten Island Road had settled that question permanently. The old bosses believed fear created obedience. Luciano learned fear also creates insurance, distance, and contingency plans. He began treating loyalty like credit, useful, conditional, and worthless without collateral. That was the real rite of passage, son. Not surviving the blade, but surviving the illusion. The illusion that power came from being feared, respected, or welcomed at somebody else's table. Power came from making yourself too connected, too informed, and too costly to remove. By 1929, Charles Luciano was no longer merely ambitious, he was permanently alert. He had been carried toward death as a disposable soldier, then returned as a future architect. The scar on his face became visible proof of a private rule: never be helpless again. The next time New York's old order reached for him, it would find the man already redesigning the game. By 1930, New York's underworld had become a machine that could feed itself and destroy itself. The old men's war began because two bosses wanted one shrinking kingdom. Joe Masseria controlled New York's largest Sicilian organization, built on tribute, fear, and personal loyalty. On the other stood Salvatore Maranzano, arrived from Castellammare del Golfo with his own Sicilian faction. Their war was called the Castellammare War, turning roots into ambush points and profitable men into targets. Luciano had money tied to trucks, bars, docks, gambling rooms, and men on both sides. Every shooting froze deliveries, every defection changed prices, every funeral made police more expensive. Masseria still demanded obedience, even after the war drained his soldiers, allies, and credibility. Demanded loyalty from men whose profits were shrinking beneath his stubborn personal feud. His final mistake was disarming his men after police pressure, mistaking control for security. Luciano, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Biondo, and others began meeting privately to discuss survival. Genovese was Luciano's ambitious ally, Anastasia a feared enforcer, Biondo a trusted lieutenant. Their purpose was not romance or revenge, it was ending a war that was bankrupting the system. They chose Masseria because he was weaker, isolated, and still believed his inner circle belonged to him. The trap was a lunch at Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a Coney Island restaurant on April 15, 1931. Masseria arrived armored with bodyguards, sitting at a rear table for bread, wine, coffee, and cards. Luciano sat with him, then left the table before the shooting, reportedly to use the bathroom. Gunmen entered behind him. Masseria was hit repeatedly and died beside his pinochle game. The exact shooters remained disputed, but the structure of the hit was unmistakable, an inside job. Luciano's message to Maranzano was cold. Masseria was removed for their own reasons.
Maranzano accepted the victory, divided New York into 5 families, then crowned himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. That was the moment Luciano understood the war had changed names, not logic. Maranzano's throne recreated every weakness, one ego, one target, one choke point above the market. Worse, reports reached Luciano that Maranzano had prepared a list targeting Luciano, Genovese, Castello, and Lansky. Castello, the Calabrian fixer, built influence through unions, officials, and quiet favors. Lansky, Luciano's Jewish financial partner, understood the danger of one boss controlling every decision. The counterplan depended on unfamiliar faces. Maranzano knew Italian soldiers. He would not easily recognize outsiders. On September 10, 1931, a group using badges entered Maranzano's headquarters at 230 Park Avenue. They forced men in the waiting room against a wall, then entered the 9th floor office suite. Maranzano was slashed and shot. The assailants escaped downstairs before police understood the scene. Accounts differ on who fired, but the strategic point is clear. Luciano's network struck before Maranzano could strike first. 2 bosses gone in 5 months, not because violence solved everything, but because their model made violence inevitable. Luciano cleared the table, then refused to sit on a throne alone. He built rules around shared profit instead. That is how old men's war ended, son. Not with peace, but with a system that punished vanity. After the old bosses fell, Luciano faced a question every conqueror avoids. What stops the next war? He had removed 2 men, but killing men does not remove the conditions that keep producing them. New York still held 5 powerful families, each with soldiers, territory, money, grudges, and ambitions. Chicago had Al Capone's outfit. Buffalo had Stefano Magaddino. Jewish syndicates controlled capital and gambling networks. One boss above all others would turn every disagreement into another succession crisis. Luciano's answer was radical for that world. Abolish the throne and build a table. He called it the Commission, a clandestine council designed to govern disputes before they became funerals. This was not democracy, son. It was disciplined self-interest wearing a tailored suit. Each major family kept its territory, soldiers, and earnings, but accepted limits on unilateral war. The 5 New York bosses held permanent seats beside representatives from Buffalo and Chicago. Luciano chaired the arrangement, but he did not call himself boss of bosses. That refusal mattered. He understood titles attract knives, while procedure distributes responsibility. The commission could hear disputes, approve major decisions, recognize leadership, and prevent reckless bloodshed. A boss no longer needed to answer every insult with gunmen. He could bring a grievance to the table. That changed the economics of power. Negotiation cost less than funerals, police raids, and frozen routes. For Luciano, peace was never softness. It was operational continuity, protected by collective consequences. If one family attacked another without approval, every other family had reason to isolate the offender. The council turned private vengeance into a public liability and impulsive violence into bad business. Maya Lansky helped connect money interests beyond Italian family boundaries. Frank Castello understood that stable rules made official protection easier to purchase. Vito Genovese saw that a national structure created larger lattice to climb. The commission did not make criminals civilized, it made their conflicts more expensive to mishandle. Behind closed doors, bosses could divide markets, settle claims, and calculate risks without public wars. The old model was feudal, one king, personal loyalty, sudden violence, and a court of frightened men. Luciano's model was colder: separate franchises, shared rules, collective enforcement, and profits above pride. No crown sat on the table, no single chair stood higher than the others. That image mattered more than speeches. It told every boss that survival required coexistence. The commission was a criminal board of directors built after a cemetery proved the old design had failed. It gave the American Mafia a national language for power, meetings, votes, boundaries, and consequences. Luciano had started as Salvatore Lucania, a street kid watching envelopes change hands in 5 points. Now he had helped turn scattered crews into a coordinated underworld capable of surviving its own ambition. That was his masterpiece, son, not the gun itself. The solemn hidden council table that made guns wait for formal collective approval and permission. By 1936, Luciano had built power that forced government to learn his language. The commission reduced wars, but its efficiency made organized crime harder for the state to ignore. New York needed a prosecutor who understood that one arrest would not break a system. It needed someone to trace lawyers, bondsmen, brothels, cash, witnesses, and fear back to one center. That man was Thomas Dewey, a young special prosecutor with a clean suit and appetite for confrontation. Dewey did not hunt Luciano through legends. He hunted paperwork around vulnerable women. His key ally was Eunice Carter, an African-American assistant prosecutor who noticed the repeating pattern. Women arrested in different brothels repeatedly used the same bondsmen and the same defense attorneys. That pattern suggested coordination, not coincidence, a hidden organization linking scattered rooms across the city.
Dewey used raids, subpoenas, records, and testimony to pressure the network into revealing its structure. In 1936, city raids swept brothels and arrested more than 100 people, mostly women. Courts set bail at $10,000, an amount many women could not possibly raise. Some decided cooperation was safer than loyalty to men who had promised protection and delivered cages. Their testimony moved upward: madams, collectors, bondsmen, managers, and eventually Luciano himself. The charge was compulsory prostitution, not bootlegging, murder, or membership in the commission. That was Dewey's calculation. A criminal architect could be reached through exposed workers.
Luciano believed distance protected him. He was rarely found collecting money or giving orders openly. But the prosecution argued he was the primary beneficiary and controlling force behind the combination. The combination was prosecutors' name for the network of brothels, pimps, money, and coercion. When police closed in, Luciano fled New York to Arkansas, believing geography still bought time. Dewey's investigators found him in Hot Springs in April 1936 and returned him under guard. The arrest changed the temperature. The man who had summoned others now entered a police car himself.
His trial began in May. The courtroom became a battlefield. Documents, witnesses, and cross-examination. No gunman could silence every witness. No agreement could erase the pattern from records. Luciano denied directing prostitution. Dewey portrayed him as a liar, hiding behind tailored distance and intermediaries. After testimony, the jury found Luciano guilty on 62 prostitution charges. He received 30 to 50 years, sending him from Manhattan into state custody. In June, he entered Clinton Prison at Clinton Mill, a remote maximum security fortress near Canada. The architect of the commission now wore prison clothes, worked under guards, and slept behind steel. But prison did not erase his name, his relationships, or the institution he had already placed on the board. Dewey had proved the state could reach him. Luciano had proved a system can outlive its founder. That was the knock at the door, son. Power is never absolute when the state finally learns your address.
Prison did not end Luciano's usefulness. War gave the state a reason to reopen his cell door. After America entered World War II, officials feared sabotage along the New York waterfront. From prison, he was consulted through intermediaries linked to waterfront figures and his old network. The record remains contested in detail, but officials later credited his cooperation as valuable to wartime security. In 1946, Thomas Dewey approved commutation of Luciano's sentence on one hard condition: permanent deportation. Freedom was not returned. It was exchanged for exile from the country where he had built his empire. On February 10th, Luciano boarded the ship Laura Keene and left New York Harbor for Italy. He stood on deck in a dark overcoat as Manhattan disappeared behind winter water and smoke. The city that made him powerful was now forbidden territory. He could never legally return.
Italy was his birthplace, but America had become his operating system, his market, and his language of power. In Naples, police watched him closely. Old allies remained across an ocean. New bosses occupied the table. He could send messages, meet visitors, and maintain influence, but he could not reclaim the center. The commission survived without him, which was both proof of his design and punishment for his absence. A system becomes real when it no longer needs the hand that designed it.
Luciano tried to rebuild relevance through contacts in Italy, Cuba, and the international narcotics trade. But exile shrinks every empire. Distance slows orders, weakens loyalty, and gives younger men room to forget. Meyer Lansky remained a lifelong associate, but even old partnerships could not erase the Atlantic Ocean. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and new American bosses now managed the ground Luciano had once mapped. He had created a council to prevent one man from becoming indispensable. Then the council proved him replaceable. That is the bitter arithmetic of power, son. Build something strong enough to outlive you, and it will. By the late 1950s, Luciano lived under surveillance, older, isolated, and far from 5 points. His scars remained, his tailored suits remained, but the rooms had become smaller and the calls less important. On January 26, 1962, Luciano went to Naples Airport to meet film producer Martin Gosch. He was considering a film about the life he had spent decades refusing to explain. At Capodichino Airport, he collapsed from a heart attack and died at age 64. No gunfire ended him. No rival took a throne. The man who outran knives lost to time. His body returned to New York and was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens. Even in death, he came back to the city that would not allow him to return alive.
Luciano's legacy was not a crown. It was a blueprint. Organized crime run as coordination, not chaos. He helped draw the board, but his final years proved that architects do not always occupy its center. If this code means something to you, subscribe and write "The table outlives the man." Which rule of Luciano's rise mattered most? Silence, alliances, structure, or knowing when to remove a king? Leave your answer below. Like, hype, and turn on notifications when you recognize discipline worth studying. Next, we open the file of Al Capone, the loud king who built an empire in Chicago. Until next time, honor the code, son, or meta, always.